Okay, so if you've read this far into the play, you're well beyond halfway, and we only have 2 acts remaining. So Act 4 is only made up of 3 scenes, but they're some of the longest scenes in the entire play. We're going to begin with Scene 1, which is on page 130 of your No Fear Shakespeare books. And I'll read for you a summary that you could copy down into yours. Okay. The weird sisters huddle around a cauldron, casting a spell when Macbeth appears and demands information. They encourage Macbeth. Lennox then appears and announces that Macduff has fled to England. This image will represent the first witch. This is the second witch. This is the third witch. And this represents all 3 witches talking together. This picture will represent Hecate. This picture will represent Macbeth in this scene. 3 apparitions appear in this scene, and the first apparition is described as a bloody and armed head. The second apparition that appears is described as a bloody child. And the third apparition that appears is a crowned child holding a tree branch.
Thrice the brinded calf hath mewed. Thrice and once the hedge pig whined.
Harpier cries, "'Tis time, 'tis time."
Round about the cauldron go, in the poisoned entrails throw. Toad, that under cold stone days and nights has 31 sweltered venom sleeping got. Boil thou first in the charmed pot.
Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
Fillet of a fenny snake, in the cauldron boil and bake. Eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog. Adder's fork and blindworm's sting, lizard leg and owlet's wing. For a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth boil and bubble.
Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Scale of a dragon, tooth of wolf, witch's mummy, moor and gulf. Of the ravine, salt sea shark, root of hemlock digged i' the dark. Liver of a blaspheming Jew, gall of goat and slips of ewe. Slivered in the moon's eclipse, nose of Turk and Tartar's lips. Finger of a birth-strangled babe, ditch delivered by a drabe. Make the gruel thicken slab, and thereto a tiger's chaldron, for the ingredients of our cauldron. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
Cool it with baboon's blood, then the charm is firm and good.
Enter Hecate. Oh, well done, I commend your pains, and every one shall share in the gains. And now about the cauldron sing, like elves and fairies in a ring, enchanting all that you put in.
By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Open locks whoever knocks.
Enter Macbeth.
How now, you secret black and midnight hags? What is it you do?
A deed without a name.
I conjure you by that which you profess, however you come to know it. Answer me. Though you untie the winds and let them fight against the churches, though the yeasty waves confound and swallow navigation up, though bladed corn be lodged and trees blown down, though castles topple on their wardens' heads, though palaces and pyramids do slope their heads to their foundations, though the treasure of nature's germens tumble all together, even till destruction sicken, answer me to what I ask you.
Speak. Demand.
We'll answer.
say if thou hadst rather hear it from our mouths or from our masters.
Call 'em, let me see 'em.
Pour in sow's blood that hath eaten her 9 farrow, grease that's sweatin' from the murderer's gibbet throw into the flame.
Come, high or low, thyself in office deftly show. Tell me, thou unknown power.
He knows thy thought. Hear his speech, but say thou naught.
Macbeth, 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 beware Macduff, beware the Thane of Fife, dismiss me, enough. Whate'er thou art, for thy good caution, thanks, thou hast harped my fear to aright, but one word more.
Will not be commanded. Here's another, more potent than the first. Macbeth, Macbeth, Macbeth.
Had I 3 ears, I'd hear thee.
Be bloody, bold, and resolute. Learn to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth.
Then live, Macduff. Whatever need I fear of thee, but yet I'll make assurance double sure, and take a bond of fate. Thou shalt not live, that I may tell pale-hearted fear it lies, and sleep in spite of thunder. What is this that rises like the issue of a king, and wears upon his baby brow the rounden top of sovereignty?
Listen, but speak not to it. Be lion-mettled, proud, and take no care who chafes, who frets, or where conspirers are. Macbeth shall never vanquished be, until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him.
That will never be. Who can impress the forest, bid the tree unfix his earthbound root? Sweet bodements, good, rebellious deed, rise never till the wood of Birnam rise, and our high-placed Macbeth shall live, the lease of nature, pay his breath to time and mortal custom. Yet my heart throbs to know one thing. Tell me, if your art can tell so much, shall Banquo's issue ever reign in this kingdom?
Seek to know no more.
I will be satisfied. Deny me this, and an eternal curse fall on you. Let me know. Why sinks that cauldron, and what noise is this?
Show! Show!
Show!
8 kings march across stage, the last one holding a mirror in his hand, followed by Banquo.
Art too like the spirit of Banquo. Down! Thy crown does sear mine eyeballs, and thy hair, thou other gold-bound brow, is like the first. A third is like the former. Filthy hags! Why do you show me this? A fourth! Start eyes! What will the line stretch out to the crack of doom? Another yet, a 7th. I see no more, and yet the 8th appears, who bears a glass, which shows me many more, and some I see that twofold balls and treble sceptres carry. Horrible sight! Now I see 'tis true, for the blood-bolted Banquo smiles upon me, and points at them for his.
The apparitions vanish.
What is this so?
Ay, sir, all this is so. But why stands Macbeth thus amazedly? Come, sisters, cheer we up his sprites, and show the best of our delights. I'll charm the air to give a sound, while you perform your antic round, that this great king may kindly say, our duties did his welcome pay.
Music sounds and the witches vanish.
Where are they? Gone? Let this pernicious hour stand accursed in the calendar. Come in, without there.
Enter Lennox.
What's your grace's will? Saw you the weird sisters? No, my lord. Came they not by you? No, indeed, my lord. Infected be the air whereon they ride, and damned all those that trust them. I did hear the galloping of a horse. Who was it came by? Is 2 or 3, my lord, that bring you word Macduff has fled to England. Fled? To England? Ay, my good lord. Thou anticipatest my dread exploits, the flighty purpose that never is o'ertook unless the deed go with it. From this moment, the very firstlings of my heart shall be the firstlings of my hand. And even now, to crown my thoughts with acts, be it thought and done. The castle of Macduff I will surprise, seize upon Fife, give edge to the edge of the sword, his wife, his babes, and all unfortunate souls that trace him in his line. No boasting like a fool. This deed I'll do before this purpose cool. But no more sights. Where are these gentlemen? Come, bring me where they are.
Okay, and that is the end of Act 4, Scene 1. And as you can see, it was a huge scene, much longer than the ones we've read before now. So we're going to return to page 130 with the start of the scene, and I'm going to go through vocabulary, and this time I'm going to look at some context as well. Because in your assignment, when you analyze this play, you want to be trying to bring in some context. So that is when and where and why this play is written into your analysis. So we're starting on page 130, and we're starting with the first line, which is thrice the brinded cat hath mewed. And I want you to look at that word brinded, and that means streaked. So there they're talking about a striped cat. And the third witch says that a harpier cries. And a harpier is a word for a type of owl, but it also could be referring to a harpy. So there's that imagery again of evil animals or animals having something to do with the witches. If you remember back to Act 1, Scene 1, they talk about Grey Melkin the cat, and they talk about a toad as well. Then we're going to go down through their spell, and we can see a lot of vicious imagery. You'll be able to get a lot of it from the right-hand page, the Modern English side. So you can see around line 5, they're talking about getting poison from a frog that has sweated under a rock for about a month. And then if we go down to the second one, the second part of the spell that happens around line 12, the second witch says, fillet of a fenny snake. And a fenny snake refers to snakes that are from the marshes of fens. And they also talk about a blind worm, and a blind worm is a reference to a small and poisonous lizard, a breed of lizard that happens to be blind. And we'll turn the page, we'll go to page 132, and we'll have a closer look at some of the imagery that the third witch states. So she's saying this is a list of all the things they're adding to the cauldron, kind of like a recipe. So she's adding a scale of a dragon, a tooth from a wolf, a witch's mummy, and then she says moor and gulf. So moor and gulf refers to a stomach and a gullet of a ravined salt sea shark. So ravined means hungry, or I should have said ravined, probably would be the way it's pronounced. And then they say root of hemlock digged in the dark. And then they say liver of a blaspheming Jew. So blaspheming means to speak against God or in this case, to speak against the Christian Bible. So there is a lot of Christian imagery here. Well, I suppose not the Christian Bible, but the books that would become the Christian Bible, because it was actually King James. Again, I mentioned him quite a lot. The king that this play was performed for, who wrote the modern day Bible. So he was very religious. So it would have been for that reason, most likely that reason, that Shakespeare included a lot of not only religious but particularly Christian, and we're looking at 17th century Christian imagery in this play. So the Christian imagery that was carried over from medieval times where things were heavily Catholic. And so it's believed to be a blasphemy to speak against those beliefs. And if you don't know this already, the main difference between people who follow Judaism and people who follow Christianity is the belief of whether or not Jesus was the Messiah. So King James, being what we would consider a Protestant Christian or an Anglican Christian, he would have been head of the Church of England as king, would have believed to say that Jesus wasn't the Messiah was a blasphemy. And he may have also believed that Jews saying that Jesus wasn't the Messiah were aligned with Satan, which was a very it's a very horrible idea. It was anti-Semitic. It's an idea that has led to horrible atrocities in the past, including the Holocaust and things that we've seen in the 20th century. But that would be why it's mentioned there, because this act of putting things in a cauldron to create magic would have been seen as satanic. So that's why all of these things are meant to be linked with something that's unnatural or satanic. And then they say gall of goat, so slips of yew. So a yew is a tree that is commonly found in churchyards and is often considered poisonous. They say nose of Turk and Tartar's lips. So again, Turks and Tartars would have been referring to people who were unbaptized. A finger of a birth-strangled babe, again something very evil, very satanic. Ditch delivered by a drabe, and a drabe is a prostitute. So they're describing they've got a finger of a baby that was given birth to in a ditch by a prostitute and then strangled. So there's all this very satanic imagery and this idea that witches are evil and satanic. And again, think about the context. So when this was written, who this is written for, why those ideas were present. Okay, and we'll go on to the next page. So now we're looking at page 134. And we'll go down to line 50 where Macbeth is talking, and he says, I conjure you by that which you profess. And again, this is another reference to Satan, the underworld, evil. So I conjure you by evil, the evil you are dedicated to. So he's saying, I call on you even though you are evil. And we'll skip the next line and we'll go to the next two where he says, though you untie the winds and let them fight against the churches. So that means to knock down the church's steeples. So again, that very idea that witches are anti-Christian, that they are satanic. The word next to that, yeasty, when it says yeasty ways, if you've ever made bread, particularly bread using a sourdough starter, you'll know that as the early dough takes in the yeast from the air and the bacteria from the air, it becomes really frothy and it froths up and it swells up. And that's the imagery that Shakespeare is trying to bring forth there about the waves that he's describing, that the witches can conjure to toss a ship around. And again, that would have been a reference to King James, because we know that he believed that witches had tossed his own ship around when he came back with his wife, Queen Anne. And we'll go down to line 59, the idea that though the treasure of nature's germins tumble all together. So that's in reference to seeds that will germinate. So the idea that the witches are basically controlling the weather. So this is all imagery of things being tossed around or churned up by the winds that the witches can control. Then the witches further down, we're looking at line 61, 62, 64, line 64, they refer to our master, and they're talking about Hecate. So they're trying to make Macbeth believe that all these apparitions that show up, so the bloody helmet head, the bloody baby, bloody child, sorry, and the other child with the crown and the branch, they're trying to make Macbeth believe they're all real or that they're all conjurings of Hecate, but we know from the previous scene that they are not, that they're just made up apparitions. Line 65, the witch refers to a sow that had eaten her 9 farrow, so that's in reference to 9 piglets. So she's talking about a mother pig that gave birth to 9 piglets and then ate them, and they've harvested her blood. And then she also mentions grease that's sweating from the murderer's gibbet, and a gibbet is in reference to a gallows, so sweat from a gallows. And then we'll go across to page 136, so the next page. After the first apparition, the armed head has appeared. And it's very important for you to note, and if it's not in your booklets, you might want to write it down somewhere else, what the 3 apparitions say, because Macbeth's told 3 things. The first thing he's told by the helmeted head is that he has to beware of Macduff. And it's interesting to note Macbeth's reaction after the apparition descends. So if you read the English side, the modern English side, because it's all in English, but we're looking at the modern English side, Macbeth says, "Whatever you are, thanks for your advice. You've guessed exactly what I feared, but one word more." And it's interesting to note that his general attitude here is that he's not really concerned about the warning that the apparition has given him, because he believes that Macduff is no match for him, that he would be able to kill Macduff in a fight. And he says, "Thou hast harped my fear aright." So that's what he's saying. And then we'll talk about the second apparition. Now, the image I could find online was of an older child. There were some drawn images of a bloody baby. And it's my belief that this apparition would have been a bloody baby, not an older child. And I'll explain why. So this apparition says, "None of woman born shall harm Macbeth." So this is the second thing that Macbeth is told, the second warning or prophecy we could say in this scene. So the first is that he should beware Macduff, and the second is, "None of woman born shall harm Macbeth." And that's line 80 to 81, and you really need to highlight that and record that in your quotes page, because it's an important quote. Now, this is the reason why I think the apparition is a baby. That is because we find out later, and this is a spoiler warning for those of you who would like to know, that Macduff was born by an old-fashioned cesarean section. So the earliest cesarean sections would have killed the mother. So when Macduff was born, his mother would have died. And in sort of an old-fashioned mindset, in this context that this play was written and performed in, many people wouldn't have considered him of a woman born. It very much could have meant that his mother died during the childbirth process, maybe by blood loss or some other consequence, and then the C-section was performed after her death, and that could be another reason why he's not considered from a woman born. And so I believe this bloody child that appears is meant to represent Macduff, covered in his mother's blood after being delivered by C-section. So not a very nice image, but that's what I think. We'll go over to page 138 now. On line 84, you see the word bond there, a bond of fate, a bond being a guarantee of security. And now we'll talk about the third apparition. It's described as a child crowned with a tree in his hand. And This child is meant to represent, some people believe and argue, Malcolm's heir, which I doubt, but considering who this is performed for and what happens later on in this scene, I believe that this child is meant to represent Banquo's heir, and that's why the child is crowned. And it says later on, we're looking at line 88 to 89, the round and top of sovereignty. So round of top and top there means crown. So the child's wearing the crown on his head, and Macbeth points it out. And then we're going to look at lines 90 to 94, the third apparition's prophecy. So the third apparition says, Macbeth shall never be vanquished, be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. Again, those lines are very important to highlight and to record on your quotes page. So what does this prophecy mean? He's basically saying to Macbeth that you don't ever need to worry until Birnam Wood, which is what it sounds like, it's a wood, so it's a forest of trees. And if you look at your maps that we've used in previous weeks, you can see that Birnam Wood is right near Dunsinane Hill, where the castle is that this play will end on. And he's saying that you don't need to worry until that forest, so that forest of trees, gets up and moves toward Dunsinane. And that fills Macbeth with overconfidence. So if you would like to make a note, just before line 95, after the third apparition speaks, Macbeth says, that will never be. So he doesn't think that could ever happen. And so at this point, he is overly confident. So if we remember from the previous scene, actually 2 scenes ago, so Act 4, Scene 5, the witches, this was their aim. They stated that explicitly, that they aimed to fill Macbeth with overconfidence, and that will lead to him dying, because they said that that was mortal's enemy. So that's very important to see that connection there. And of course, another spoiler, this does happen. So when the forces come from England, so Malcolm, with the help of England, comes back through Scotland, they stop in Birnam Wood and they discuss how they're going to stealthily sneak up to the castles. Now, I didn't understand this properly the first few times I've read this play earlier in my life, but when I visited Scotland, I saw why a lot of the castles around Scotland are built purposefully on large hills, and that's a great disadvantage to anyone who's invading the castle, because if you're sitting there, you can see people coming from a mile off. You could prepare your catapults, your trebuchets, whatever weaponry you had, your own soldiers, and send them out down the hill, and it would be very hard or basically impossible to sneak attack one of these castles. So what England and Malcolm do is they decide to disguise themselves, and they disguise themselves as the trees of Birnam Wood. They cut down the trees and the branches, and they disguise themselves, and then they move toward the castle, and the people in the castle, from their vantage point up high, watch the wood, because it looks like the entire wood, move toward them, and that's exactly how they phrase it to Macbeth. Okay, so page 140. We see Macbeth say, and an eternal curse fall on you. I've underlined that. It's just something to note. But this is what I want to talk to you about. It is the 8 Kings. So this, I think, is one of the most clever scenes in the entire play for what they do here. So they bring in 8 people dressed as different kings, the last one being Banquo. So each of these kings is meant to represent one of Banquo's descendants. And one of these people who are dressed as kings is holding, it says in the early modern English, so the Shakespearean English stage directions, that it's holding a glass. But we know that this is a mirror from Macbeth's descriptions. So we see that he's describing them, and he's saying that the first one's wearing a crown and it sears his eyeballs because he's so angry that another family line is going to take his crown from him because he recognizes that this is Banquo's line. He's like, oh, your crown, it hurts my eyes, I don't want to look at it. And he says that your hair and other gold-bound brow is like the first, so there's a second one wearing the crown, and he's saying there's a third and a fourth, and he keeps asking, let's stop, and he's counting them all, and then he says, yet the eighth appears who bears a glass. So the eighth one, if we imagine 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 have already walked through, and the eighth one comes in holding, I'm imagining, a large mirror. And he stops in the middle of the stage holding the mirror in a particular way. And Macbeth doesn't look at this king. He's looking in the mirror and he's describing the king he sees in the reflection. And he says that two folds balls and treble scepters carry. So if we look at the English side, it's saying who's carrying double balls and triple scepters. So he's talking about a king who's holding 2 balls and 3 scepters. So what does this mean? Well, when King James, the man who Shakespeare was performing this play for, was crowned King of England, you think you might have seen old paintings where a king or queen is holding a special ball with a small ornament on top and a scepter in one hand. And that was a special ceremony that took place when the king or queen of England was crowned. When this happened for King James, he was given 2. One to represent Scotland, where he was already king, and one to represent England, because he was uniting the 2 kingdoms. So, in fact, the king that Macbeth is describing there isn't one of the kings on stage, but the king in the audience who they were showing in the mirror. So that's very interesting because we know in real life, in the real life context where this play was written and performed, King James was the descendant of Banquo. And then there's a phrase there at the very bottom, Bud bolted Banquo, and that's referring to his hair still being matted with blood. We'll turn to page 142. The first witch is speaking on line 130. She refers to the antic round, which is a fantastic dance. And then the witches dance and vanish. On line 134, Macbeth says, stand I accursed, and I means ever. So be cursed forever. I'll go over to page 144, the last page. We'll skip over everything Lennox says, it's pretty straightforward. And we'll look at what Macbeth says when he speaks to himself. So at line 149, he says, the very firstlings of my heart shall be the firstlings of my hand. So he's basically making this out loud promise to himself that from this point on, he's not going to fret and overthink things that pop into his mind. So if you think back to the start of the play, when his mind started thinking about murdering Duncan, he tried to suppress that, and it took him a very long time to act on it. Then, when he started to be afraid of Banquo, it took him less time to plan out that murder. And he's saying here, from now on, when I want to kill somebody, I'm going to do it straight away. As soon as the thought comes into my head, my hand is going to do the action. I'm not going to think about it. And that this marks a huge change in his character. And then it's interesting to note or highlight this as a quote further down where he says, seize upon Fife and give to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, and all unfortunate souls that trace him in his line. This is in reference to Macduff. Now, there's some more analysis that can be done here. So this part is completely fictional. The real Macbeth that existed in the 11th century wasn't known to have ever put an entire family line of nobles to the sword. However, what is known is that it was Macbeth's family and family line that was put to the sword in such a brutal way. And in real life, the person that did this or ordered it wasn't Macbeth, who was known as a good king, but it was Malcolm III, the very Malcolm who is depicted in this play as the good guy. So why would Shakespeare have made this intentional choice, this intentional change to make Macbeth this villain who kills a family when in real life he was the victim whose family was killed? Well, that's because Macbeth needs to be portrayed as an enemy to make it look like a good thing that England is working with Malcolm. That's because the message of this play is one of hope for England and Scotland. So Shakespeare is trying to rewrite history in this play by making it seem like England and Scotland have had an amicable, which means friendly, relationship in the past, which in fact, at least in this instance, was untrue, because it was actually a bad thing, many would have thought, to reinstate Malcolm, who was such a vicious king, when Macbeth had been such a good one in real life. So that's just something interesting to note about the context. And if I was analyzing in an essay and I was saying something about describe Macbeth's descent into becoming a murderer, I might say something like, Shakespeare made this choice to show Macbeth killing Macduff's family to make him seem like a villain and to make it seem like a good thing that England was working with Scotland. So that could be something I could say in an essay if I was discussing context.